Friends, I would like to welcome you all to our March edition of Focus Conversation organized by Leadership Focus International. And our topic for today is democracy under attack. I'm welcoming you to join together with us because we are dealing with a very delicate subject, especially in the light of the recent developments that have started 2 weeks ago, and they have I dare say, radically changed the world. At a time when few of us were starting planning this webinar some couple of months ago, maybe even earlier than that, we had something else in mind. We were planning to have a conversation and discussion on the question of decaying democracy in the world, because we are realizing and we are agreeing that over the last several years, democracy is getting in a worse and worse shape steadily, one step at a time, but certainly getting worse. And especially during those couple of years of the pandemic, we have also seen the tendency to see actually democracy going down gradually. But as I said a moment ago, 2 weeks ago, the world has changed radically. One country, for no reason, without any cause, attacked another country. And I'm sure you are all glued to the television screens and other means and are watching what is happening there. This invasion on Ukraine by the Russian regime, and forgive me if I want to put a disclaimer here, because I've been criticized myself for using the word Russian, because I have a difficulty how to call this invasion. But definitely 2 weeks ago, Putin's military machinery has entered Ukraine, has occupied a country that has done her nothing wrong. And this attack and aggression and invasion is becoming viciously worse by each new day. So today we cannot speak about democracy being under attack and simply ignore the fact that one country has attacked another country without any provocation. So somehow, my friends, we're going to try to blend those two things together, situation in Ukraine, and also the question about democracy into one theme, and we will see how successful we are going to be about this. We certainly are not going to provide the answers that probably many others are not able to provide at this moment, but I would be glad if we somehow benefit and are blessed just by this conversation that is going to happen in a moment. Maybe we are just going to begin to see a little bit things from a different perspective. Maybe it helps us just to develop even more empathy. And maybe it helps us also to go in the right direction in answering the question how we as followers of Jesus have to relate to this. There are 3 questions that are going to guide our conversation today. They're going to be like background questions to what we are going to talk about today. Are we living in the days of declining democracy? And if we do, why? And then the other one is the attack on Ukraine attack on democracy too? If it is, in what ways? And then what I consider certainly personally as the most important question, because I'm struggling with this, what are the principles that ought to guide the followers of Jesus as we are trying to relate to both of those questions? Question of decaying democracy and question of the attack on one country by another one for no reason. And at this point, friends, I need to put some words of disclaimer here, because we need to be aware that our panelists are going to speak in their private capacity and not necessarily representing the views of their or the organizations they're working for or they're associated with. This is very important to have in mind as we proceed with our conversation today. And now let me just quickly introduce our panelists in order as they will speak. I'm welcoming Camila Bokaniala from Norway, but I can also say that she's from Romania. She's an artist and a social activist and the program director and the co-founder of Polylogos Association, which is a leadership development organization. And I'm welcoming Dr. Jill Hall. She is a city councilwoman in Kettering, Ohio, and she is also a adjunct professor at United Theological Seminary. Then I'm welcoming Liviu Bocaniala from Romania. He's an artist, he is a social activist, and he's the president and the co-founder of Polylogos Association, which, as I said a moment ago, is a leadership development organization. And then I have a special privilege to welcome and invite Anya Vasilov from Ukraine. Anya has worked for the European Union and Ukraine cooperation in civil security sector and she has a professional background in European Union policies and governance, and a number of other related things. And also Anya is a board member of an international children charity working for children in Ukraine. And if I understand correctly, also not only in Ukraine, but also in some other countries too. And then I would like to welcome Andrew Nedelchev from Bulgaria. Andrew is the IT professional and a public speaker on the values of the kingdom of God and their application to businesses and politics, the arts, and everyday life. And at this point, we are going to begin with our conversation today. And I want to begin, Camilla, with you. I would like to ask you the first question. There is this declining trend of democracy in the world today that we are witnessing. And I would like you to talk about this, and especially about the attitudes of Christians toward that. What are some of the main challenges facing democracies in the world today? And should we, people of faith, care?
Thank you, Tiamir. I'm not sure I'll be able to answer all those questions at once, but maybe throughout our conversation later on as well. Tiamir, despite this being one of my favorite topics for discussion, I have never been so unprepared for a talk. So unless I start rambling, in which case you have full permission to interrupt me, I might actually manage to keep the time limit that you have given me this time. And then we will have time for discussions later on. So let me just jump in. Democratic backsliding or decay in democracy is nothing new. Freedom House reports that 2022 is the 16th consecutive year of decline in global freedom. 60 countries experienced democratic backslidings in the past year, and only 25 improved. Currently, 38% of the world population live in a country classified as not free, which is the highest percentage since 1997. The pandemic brought a host of new challenges to democracy, and the differences between the ways the crisis was handled by our political leaders and the outcomes of the pandemic in the different countries were substantial. I am sure many comparative studies will be done to measure different factors and their effects on democracy, on freedom, on social cohesion and crisis management over the next few decades. I have my hypotheses, but I will leave them for another discussion because right now, the threat to democracy is not just conceptual, it is very much physical. In my humble opinion, the aggressive invasion of Ukraine signifies not just an attack on a country, a territory, or a nation, but on democracy itself. In 2019, the people of Ukraine elected a pro-European, pro-democracy president. This was no doubt a big blow to the big neighbor's president in the East, who since his election 20-some years ago has been carefully and methodically undermining the very democratic institutions that put him in a place of power to begin with, crafting a centralized state system that revolves around and fully depends on him. The pro-democracy movement in Russia, which has been heavily oppressed and criminalized in various ways over the years, no doubt found inspiration and was reinvigorated by the democratic movements of their neighbors in Ukraine. We know from countless studies that one of the best predictors of democracy in a country is the geographic proximity it has to another democratic country. In other words, democracy flourishes when surrounded by other free democracies. And while this is good news for the pro-democracy advocates in Russia, it is very bad news to the country's president, who's been working so hard and so long to make sure that his position of power will never really, in all seriousness and realistically, be contested. As Ukraine has higher electoral participation than most democratic countries, and as the people and the leader of Ukraine moves towards more liberal Western democratic ideals, it has become a threat, not to Russia, but to its leader and his authoritarian nationalist ideology. The war in Ukraine both follows and amplifies an information war as well that has been raging for many years. The awareness of this war became mainstreamed during the pandemic when two polarized alternative realities surfaced, depending on where the algorithm guided you on social media. This information war, which we have spoken about and discussed at length in previous webinars during the pandemic, undermines and threatens democracy because it disintegrates the social fabric and the trust in our societies. Democracies cannot thrive, doubtfully even survive, without at least some level of trust between each other as neighbors, between us and our elected leaders, and between us and the democratic institutions that protect and uphold our democracies. I mentioned this at the previous webinar we had in February, but it's important in this context, so I will repeat myself. We have a choice to assume the best about each other or to assume the worst. And while I cannot quote them now, there is conclusive evidence from several studies of social psychology showing that people have a tendency to live up to other people's expectations. So my suggestion is this: let's assume and expect the best from each other. Isn't that also what Jesus did when he befriended sinners, prostitutes, and tax collectors? Everyone else had already labeled them and treated them according to their labels, but not Jesus. Jesus treated them with dignity and respect as equals, and they grew out of their labels and became dignified, respectable people that he always treated them as. I have to admit, I really struggled to prepare a cohesive message today because I'm so wrapped up in the tragedy that is taking place in our backyard, and it's hard to think of abstract concepts and theories and the bigger picture when everything is so up close. But if there's one thing that burns inside of me, a message that I would give to you all without self-censoring too much, it would be this: to stop deflecting, to stop the whataboutism, the gaslighting, the stubbornly repeating the same rehearsed slogans over and over again. The war in Ukraine is unjustified, period. Killing mothers, daughters, sons, fathers, sisters, grandmothers, aunts, and uncles is always unjustified. Bombing schools, hospitals, residential areas is never justified. It doesn't matter what someone did sometime in the past. One crime does not excuse another. So let's come back to our senses and love our neighbors. The title for this webinar is Democracy Under Attack. It is under attack on many fronts, from without and from within, and it has been for a long time. Democracy in any country is only as strong as its people's commitment to it. And the strength of democracy in one country is dependent on the strength of the democracies in its neighborhood. So should Christians care about democracy? Short answer, yes. Why? Short answer, because democracy correlates with higher standards of living, higher education, peace, better health, longer life expectancy, the list goes on. Because democracy is at its core really just a method for us as people to resolve conflicts in a non-violent way through discussions, debates, competition, collaboration. Because democracy protects the freedom and dignity of the other, even those who are vulnerable, even those we disagree with, even those we consider our enemies. And although it's far from perfect, because nothing us humans ever do can ever be perfect, from where I'm standing, a system that encourages us to listen to and respect and protect our neighbors is still the closest thing we got to what Jesus modeled for us. So I could go on, Tiomir, but I'm going to stop it here, and I hope we'll have some time for conversation later on.
Thank you, Camilla. And I'm going to pick up on your more concluding words, that why democracy? Why should people of faith stand behind democracy? Although it is not perfect, yet it comes closest to the ideals of what I would say Christianity stands for when we read it undiluted from the pages of the New Testament. And I'm putting disclaimer, it's not perfect, it's far from perfect, but it's by far, far much better than anything else in a way that it takes care of people. And I would just add a moment to what you have been saying about Ukraine. What has been guided me when people come in and accuse me of siding here or there is, there are simply two facts that are guiding my thinking. Ukraine has existed as a legitimate country internationally recognized for 30 plus years. So no one has have any right to go back and reconstruct the history to their advantage. And the other thing is that the country has been viciously attacked without any provocation. And I think that's why we need to stand with the people of Ukraine. But now I'm going to Jill. Jill, let's move to United States of America. And I have a question for you. Now, we have been talking a little bit about Ukraine. What about America? Is America taking democracy for granted? Could you tell us something about this, Jill?
Yes, thank you. I'm anxious to hear from our Ukrainian friend today. And Ukraine is on the mind of many, many people in the United States. I want to speak, though, specifically to the risk to democracy in the US and what Ukraine has to do with that. And it's actually the risk to democracy in the United States has had to do with Russia for quite some time. So I'm going to talk briefly about that, the relationship of the Christian faith community here, and a brief word on NATO as well, because a lot of disinformation has been going around about NATO in the US. There's a document, it's a scholarly paper that I really recommend. It's very readable. It was published back in 2017, and it's called Sharp Power. And it's a report by the National Endowment for Democracy in the United States. And it detailed both Russia and China, and I'm just going to focus on the Russia portion of this, but how they've been using authoritarianism to increase authoritarianism and destabilize democracies, to specifically using media. So Russia influences have been coming through the media and social media for quite some time. The government has known about it. They're using sophisticated information warfare to foster discord here, and they have a recent history of accomplishing that, specifically in Poland and Argentina. For years, they've been doing this. And another tactic that Putin has used is courting relationships with up-and-coming American leaders towards the same disinformation end. Because if you're a leader in your industry and whatever that is, you can go back and influence people. So he's targeted influencers. He's astute. In the same way, he's also been working our past president, Trump, to practically and maybe literally making him a Russian asset. Putin has been working American evangelicals. This is a tactic. While many on social media, though, would like to portray evangelicals as Putin lovers, it's actually a small minority. In this instance, in regards to our recent issues with authoritarianism and things that make you say, do evangelicals really want democracy? this huge majority of the United States Christians are in support of Ukraine. But pro-Putin evangelicals do exist, and it's the usual suspects of people whom are the vocal minority. Lance Wallnau, self-proclaimed charismatic prophet with a massive following, has praised Putin. Dinesh D'Souza tweeted that he stands with Putin because Ukraine somehow poses a greater threat to the United States than Russia. There was a crazy Delaware Republican candidate that went viral for praising Putin and saying that he's promoting Christian values. I mean, clearly a fringe element. And then, of course, Eric Metaxas is in support of Putin. But a really astute example is Putin has been courting a relationship for many years with Franklin Graham, who has also signaled support for him in the past. And what I want to really emphasize here, and it really dovetails nicely from what Camilla was saying, is that I don't want to bash Christians. We've talked about it at length at our webinars. Many like me here and among the friends here have been baffled by the position of evangelicals in America in the last several years, leading to the most simplest of things. We have a global pandemic and they don't want to wear their masks, and they're the ones who don't want to wear their masks. And it seems like this is the most poignant black and white example of Christians not being able to love their neighbor. But guess what has not worked this whole time is bashing Christians. It just doesn't work. Oftentimes it's the vocal few against these things. Sometimes there are more than others who vote and have values that don't seem to be in line with scriptural priority to me. But by focusing on the vocal few, I think in creating this atmosphere that's increasingly distrustful of Christianity in the United States, we may actually begin to affect religious liberty more here. It is not working to blame and deride. It just pushes people farther away. And I think that Christians like those of us who are speaking, who are not on the far right, but quite Christ-centered, would say maybe American evangelicals brought their reputation and consequences on themselves. But I have had a check in my spirit for several years and about not bashing Christians. And that's what I want to say is that it's not working. The cultural divide has become even more dangerous. And particularly in this case, as I'd mentioned, that the vocal minority does not represent the community as a whole. I do know well-meaning brothers and sisters in the faith who have, in good faith, repeated disinformation about this conflict because they heard it from a trusted leader. So I just want to say a couple points about NATO and then move on. Russia has been spreading disinformation about NATO for many years, all towards the end game of invading Ukraine, which is also why there was a disinformation campaign in Poland in particular. It was towards that goal. In Central Europe, Moscow's primary aim is to undermine support for EU and NATO membership by playing up the idea of a Slavic identity and fraying target population's sense of identification with Western institutions. What NATO is a defensive alliance whose purpose is to protect its members. While I lived in the Balkans, many nations' main political goal was entry into NATO for this reason. NATO's presence in a region has always been at the request of the host nation. NATO enlargement is not directed towards Russia, and they actually worked with Russia on a number of things for 30 years. This was suspended in 2014 due to Russia's aggressive actions in Ukraine that started back then, 2014. However, they're still working on trying to build a cooperative relationship with Russia. So that's all I want to say about NATO. It could be that Russian disinformation campaigns, which are massive in the United States, are behind the division in the church, and how effective and cunning Putin has been to go after the faith community to create a cultural divide. There is no question that they've interfered in our democracy, as well as attempting to interfere with our elections, and were successful on some fronts, for reasons not least of which are their present actions in Ukraine. Putin strategically has used religion, not only in the United States, but Russia, the way the Roman Empire used Catholicism, the way Ireland used Protestantism to kill Catholic Irish, the way Catholics killed the way Catholics killed Protestants with the Huguenots, on and on. And it's important to note that there's more Christians percentage-wise in Ukraine than Russia. It's just not accurate that Russia is this Christian nation fighting a dark nation or something. And many of the Christians have been killed or are now refugees. To put a kind of a Forrest Gump, if you've seen that movie, spin on the book of James, I like to think of it as Christian is as Christian does. And genocide is not Jesus-centered. The scriptures also say you will know followers of Christ by their fruits. And that is a scripture I live by. So as a democracy, in closing, as a democracy, we need to increase average citizens' awareness of the reality of Russians' interference in our democracy in the United States, as well as the reality of life in Russia. As Christians, we need to be building bridges as a community to one another. There's no longer the luxury of avoiding conversations, I think, or being clannish with those who believe like us if we have any chance of being a community of hope, but it also is furthering division, and disdain of people of faith is further eroding our democracy as well. So with that, I just wanted to mention, I think it's time for Christians on the left and the right to start mending fences rather than fighting each other more, because that specifically is affecting democracy. And it's a Russian tactic, a smart one. And the most important point in all of this right now is the Ukraine. So I look forward to hear from our friend from Ukraine.
Thank you, Jill. I find your contribution to this webinar to be pretty much insightful, and it is my observation too that as far as now the conflict, the aggression against Ukraine, there is more unanimity among the believers in USA, which is a very promising sign, much more than during the time of pandemics in regard to pandemics and many other things. This is a very much encouraging side. The other thing I would like to say that probably this challenge affecting, how is this aggression affecting the Christian community is much more vivid, closer to some of our European homes, and especially in this region that are closer to Russia and Ukraine. It's much more obvious, this polarization within the Christian community of actually empathizing with Ukraine, or basically whatabouting and gaslighting and all the other things, even to the pretty much clear justification of the aggression. And I'm sure that Andrew Nedelchev later on is going to address this a little bit more clearly than what I'm saying here. I'm just looking at a comment here that Rachel has placed here. Putin is no friend of evangelicals. Look up the Yaranoy, I hope I pronounce it correctly, law, and how it has been used to restrict religious freedom in Russia. Also, look at the situation in those two provinces in Ukraine that have been in the hands of Russians since 2014, how religious freedom and how this kind of variety of acceptance of Christian faith is being treated there, comparing with Ukraine. I mean, for example, apart from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and apart from Catholic Church and I know others, there are lots of Protestants and evangelicals in Ukraine who are working perfectly with every freedom. So this is also saying, I hope I'm not mistaken in what I'm saying. This is speaking volumes. But now we are moving a step forward. And Livio, I'm coming to you now. We are coming closer to the actual situation of what is happening now on the ground. Before we ask Anya to speak to us, and you are in Romania together with your wife Camila, and from the very first day when this aggression started, you have been 24/7 actually engaged, and not only you, but with some other of your friends, trying to do whatever you can you can to help the refugees, people from Ukraine coming the Romanian way. What does this look like? How has this impacted you? Could you share a little bit with us?
My phone might start ringing every minute now, as it did indeed for the last 2 weeks, especially in the evening hours. So I'll try and be short. I will say in one word that on one hand, there is no difference between the work we did a few years ago, Tihomir and some other of our friends, and what's happening now, the work we're doing now. Ukrainians and Syrians and Iranians and Afghans are all the same people. They get depressed, they cry, they bleed the same red blood. They get hungry and scared. And of course, if they are not helped, they either die or become radicalized. So I would say, ultimately, it doesn't matter to whom you give your time or your bread or your money. The commandment given to us, the commandment that is equal to loving God with your whole system, everything in one's reach, right? The commandment is to love your neighbor. No color of skin is mentioned, no specific language or dialect, no friend or enemy label is mentioned in this commandment. Love your neighbor, period. And here we are, 613.8 kilometers of neighborhood. And by extension, because Moldova, Republic of Moldova, is also exposed big time to this drama, yet another 681.3 kilometers of neighborhood. Now I ask you, do you think this is enough neighbor to love, as in commandment? So no, there is no difference between the work we did a few years ago and the work we're doing now. On the other hand, I would say definitely, yes, there is a big difference between, on one side, the fields of corn at the border between Serbia and Croatia, where we found ourselves, probably in the most literal way, while serving the enemy of our holy religions and cultures, to quote some of my friends on social media. And on the other side, these our days civilized borders, where certain guards are charging fees who are increasing, I think they double every week, okay? So they are charging fees to let one cross according to the size of one's car or fashion display. This happens at least until the women and the children appear to cross. We have so many stories already, and it does seem we live in some kind of movie lately. Sometimes early in the morning when we wake up, the silence here where we live is so thick that makes me think the war and the refugees are just a bad dream. Until I pick up the phone and the notifications are pouring out of my screen. And then we just continue where we left last night or just a few short hours ago. I would say, Tihomir and dear friends, that democracy is like old poetry these days. Everybody is quoting it to look and sound cool, but nobody is insisting on bringing it back. I love words, so it is no wonder I get depressed when words lose their meanings. Demos kratia, the power of rule of whole citizens living within a particularly defined territory, right? This is democratic. Democracy comes from Greek, yeah? And this is what it means: the power of rule of whole citizens living within a particular defined territory. This sounds to me very empty these days, when the quality of a human being is defined by a biometric passport or the absence of it. So, dear friends, why are we even bothering? Does it even matter when shameless exhibitionists spread the fetid smell of death with each sentence they articulate, ranging from the schizophrenic chorus "they stole the elections" to narcissistic egos exploding overnight, quite in a literal manner, west to east and east to west, all the same Balkans, blood and honey in continuous reloading. Complete madness. And let me ask you even further, are we any different? What are our real opinions and beliefs when we are all alone? And how about our language? What are our tongues rolling and our teeth grinding when no one is watching? Because they say this is the measure of one's character. And may I suggest, we cannot have democracy without character. We cannot keep pretending that we are these amazing creatures when we walk in the agora, the public market, while we are poor golems when the lights dim and we get off the stage. So again, in the space between helping 20 babies without a country lost somewhere at the outskirts of the city with a milk bottle, and on the other hand, holding to your chest the whipping head of your friend who just crossed the border with his family and an 83-year-old aunt, we really do not have too much time for big words or concepts. But we do have all the time in the world to exercise our character. Even if we should not, and with great respect for my sister Jill and my sister Heather, we will leave it to the politicians to fix the chaos they are creating. We are a bit too busy these days with being humans to our neighbors. And as a good friend of mine says, other than this, people, I have no opinion. I actually want to allow the poetry to give you a real opinion about what is happening tonight, not too far from where we are. I was reminded today of the lyrics of a Romanian poet who says these next words. And I waited for you at every train of my life to welcome you. You didn't come, or you passed by without getting off. Now, when it is so late that there are no more trains for another year, I imagine you were on each and every one of them. But you're tired like an elk chased at the northern pole by a pack of fairies, and by the fear and by the cold. I imagine you fell asleep and that you were dreaming that is why you didn't get off. Like a woman waiting for her lover to return from the war, I waited for you, God, at all the trains of my life, come rain or come shine, until I unraveled. Wake up, God, before you arrive in a foreign land.
Thank you, Livio. I think I am beginning to understand what you are saying. I'm not in a situation which you are, as you're on a daily basis communicating between the border and the Cluj and trying to help some people. But when you said, maybe I'm not saying it exactly the way you have said it, you don't have time for politics right now. You don't have time for big analysis about the situation. And I will expand this and go into who is to blame and is there someone else to blame before this one and before this one and before that, because you are seeing the real situation there. And this is exactly what I've answered to some of my friends who, when I put on Facebook my support on a human side for the people who are suffering in Ukraine and are trying to gaslight me, I'm saying, I don't have time. I'm going to think about this and maybe write about this later. I don't have time for this right now. What I'm really concerned is about the suffering of the people. And this is bringing me now to Anya, and it's really an honor to have you here with us. And I even don't know how to properly introduce you into what you are going to share. I myself been in touch over those few days with several of our friends from Ukraine, whether they're living in Ukraine right now or whether they're already out. And I've repeatedly said to them, I'm overwhelmed. I really don't know what to say to you that would be so profound in your situation. I say I'm praying for you, which I am doing, but is this enough to comfort you? So what I would like you to, Anya, to open a little bit your heart with us and tell us, you are right now in Ireland. You went to visit your sister, if I understand correctly, to Ireland before even the aggression started, and you found yourself there. But you're not suffering in any way less than people who are in your country, maybe even more in some sense, because you are observing what is happening with the people you know, family members you know. Could you share a little bit of your heart? What does this look like now for you to live through this aggression in your country from one day to another? Please, Anya.
Thank you, Tihomir. Good evening and good morning, everyone who is this webinar. It's a real honor for me to be invited. I've never been. I'm really touched that by everything that you said, Tihomir, and I know that everyone is supporting Ukraine and but also sometimes people just don't know how to answer. I noticed it for myself. It just, time has stopped for me, has completely changed my perspective on life, on everything. And sometimes I may not be able to reply the same way as I reply usually. And my personal story is the story that before 2 weeks ago, I lived and worked in Kyiv, in the capital of Ukraine. And now I had my whole life there. I had my apartment, my family, everything is there. And now I don't know if I will ever be able to return. Every day I pray that my house is not destroyed by Russian airstrike, that it's not shot by a tank. I pray for my city to stay strong, not to be occupied. I pray for people to really to live, because today, every hour brings thousands of dead lives. And you know that people from the president to the child asking to NATO, EU, God, everyone, just to close the sky, to be able to not live in fear of being shot by Russian missile. This is the priority number one for people in Ukraine, to be able to have a chance for life. I was not in Kyiv when it happened. my mother was. For 10 days, she was sleeping in the in the bathroom, or sleeping in the bomb shelter. I was not sleeping, I was not eating, it was real, even though I was not in Kiev, I was really feeling for it. I have an app and I receive every time there is an airstrike and people have to go to shelter, I receive notification. And every 2 hours, as we speak now, there is an airstrike siren going on in Kiev. People who were trying to leave, so I was just saying how huge were lines to get to the border. Many people are still moving from all over Ukraine to get to, and people who stay, they are in fear, living in constant fear for their lives, and they are also in constant fear also to leave, because many people are shot while they're trying to leave and find safety in Western Ukraine or abroad. So this is the situation. I mean, I can also, you know, that many cities that are occupied by Russian army. They have no humanitarian access, no water, no electricity, no food. And this is a genocide. This is a real genocide happening on the European soil in the 21st century, with all the international organizations, all the technology, all the money that we have, and all the achievements of the 2 world wars that European soil experienced, and no lessons learned from that. I just want to say a few reflections that I've heard from speakers, and I'm very grateful for your interventions. They were extremely knowledgeable, they were very accurate, and with good quotes. Bravo for this preparation. I really admire your knowledge. What touched me the most was that Tihomir, you said that all religion communities were united in support of Ukraine. I think that Ukraine united also European Union, and United States, Canada, and all the countries of the world. But at what price? Ukraine united Western world at the price of children's lives and thousands of people's lives. And this war, another point that I want to underline, that this war did not start on the 24th of February. It started 8 years ago when Russia annexed Crimea and invaded Ukraine in Donbass. But for all of us in Ukraine as well, it was far away. It was some regions that are, okay, they are pro-Russian. And we didn't, Western world only implemented sanctions against some leaders. It was just, it was just a conflict there. But it was already the war. And back then, 8 years ago, people who lived normal lives, good lives in Donetsk, Lugansk, almost 2 million people displaced within Ukraine from that region, almost 1 million people living in the gray zone between occupied and non-occupied, and another 2 million displaced to Russia, Belarus, and other countries. So the war started 8 years ago, and I think that it was a big mistake by the West not to react back then. And now West is also, it's reacting more than it reacted back then. will this West doing now to support Ukraine? Will it be enough to save lives of people?
Thank you very much. We did lose you for a few moments, a few times, but I don't think that we have lost your message. I think we have got what you were sharing with us. It is not enough, and I totally agree with you, that we who are not in Ukraine, you know, from the world, rest of the world, are united only in empathy, theoretically, without trying to find a solution that works. It is not enough. It is not enough to be just sorry for what is happening right now in your country. I hope we are going to have some time for conversation, and we would gladly have you back to answer maybe some questions or add a few more thoughts. But right now, I'm going to go to Andrew. Andrew, we are coming now to you with a question about, which is specifically now applying to, I would say, although I live in America, but I still consider Balkan my home. So that really is applying to our region. And the fact that at the time when we should all at least empathize with the people of Ukraine, there is still, among some of our brothers and sisters Christians, there is going to so much of, I would freely say it, gaslighting, deflecting, blame shifting, spiritualizing away, even justifying the aggression. Could you tell us how come that some Christians are now doing this? And how do we build a sound Christian response to this crisis?
There is a sense in which I'm approaching the whole topic of this webinar, the attack on democracy from within, stemming from the most fragile core of democracy, which is demos, the people, us, human beings. On the very first day the Russian forces entered Ukraine, I turned to online social networks in order to check on my friends there and get a feel for the situation on the ground. Reading the impressions of the first morning of bombing and watching the videos recorded by people I know, my spontaneous reaction was to share those with my contacts lists in order to inform, but also share the feelings of shock, of compassion and care. Browsing through the news feed in search of the latest posts, I was also quickly shaken by the fact that so many of my contacts had found it important to emphasize that there are two sides to every story. And since that first day, the situation has become even worse. Now, 2 weeks later, in the face of a clearly aggressive and unprovoked war, with more than 2 million refugees having fled the country already, these were the numbers reported by the BBC yesterday, a number expected to eventually reach as many as 7 million, and with as many as 12 million Ukrainians expected to be displaced within the borders of their country. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees has called it the fastest growing refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. With all of that in the background, tens of people I personally know very well are writing or sharing unusually long posts claiming that the Ukrainian government includes Nazis responsible for torturing thousands of Russian-speaking Ukrainians in Donbass ever since 2014. So it's a process that has never stopped. Or how NATO and the USA are to be blamed for pushing Putin against the wall due to their greed for world domination and natural resources. These same contacts are accusing us, everyone who's empathizing with Ukraine and writing about it, they're accusing us of hypocrisy and paying so much attention to Ukraine, having at the same time neglected the wars in Syria, Afghanistan, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and many others. Personally, I'm wondering how can they be sure that I neglected these wars? But anyway. Any amount of references to studies and reports arguing against the truthfulness of these claims is being met with the accusation of brainwashing by the mainstream media, Any invitations to engage with well-supported facts and carefully reasoned argumentation are simply waved off with the response that everyone is entitled to their own opinions and every opinion is just as good as the next one. And shockingly, many of these people are Christians. And a predominant number of them happen to think the COVID pandemic was a conspiracy and are distrustful of COVID vaccines. The overlap is pretty obvious and significant in my view. So what is the cause for such widespread absurdity? In my view, it's a complex combination of objective and subjective factors. And while I definitely cannot provide an exhaustive analysis at this point, I would like to at least point to a few suggestions. On the objective side, just like Camille and Jill mentioned, it's a fact that there has been a hybrid war going on for years now. Not only by Russia, but Russia is a very big force in that war indeed. For example, an internal Facebook report written in September 2019 and published 2 years later by the MIT Technology Review, who obtained it from a former Facebook employee, found that in the run-up to the 2020 election, Facebook's most popular pages for Christian and Black American content were being run by Eastern European troll farms. Who said Eastern Europe is insignificant? These pages were part of a larger network that collectively reached nearly half of all Americans. The data said 140,000 Americans were reached daily by the pages originating from these troll farms. This reach was not achieved because users actively looked for such pages, but as a result of Facebook's own platform design and engagement-hungry algorithm. In other words, Facebook was pushing the content to them. More specifically, as of October 2019, as many as 19 of the top 20 Facebook pages targeting Christian Americans, so 19 out of the 20 top, were being run by troll farms based in Eastern Europe. My own parents have shared publications originating from these pages. Furthermore, the report found that troll farms were reaching the same demographic groups singled out by the Kremlin-backed Internet Research Agency during the 2016 election, things that Joe has already referred to. Back then, they were targeting Christians, Black Americans, and Native Americans. In the words of Jeff Allen, who is the author of the above-mentioned report, our platform has given the largest voice in the Christian American community to a handful of bad actors who, based on their media production practices, have never been to church. Unfortunately, I don't have such data for Europe or Eastern Europe in particular, but I have read studies and reports for Bulgaria and have my own observations to back them up. A large amount of the conspiracy theories circulating on Facebook, as well as the pro-Putin arguments in favor of the war, clearly originated from troll farms and are then spread even further out by unethical media outlets and journalists vying for attention by any means possible. While hybrid war is not a new thing at all, virtual social networks present us with a dynamic that is quite unexplored for most of us. And the truth is, few people possess the knowledge and critical skills that will allow them to see through the deception and the truth. I realize that even us who are participating in this webinar are in a pretty privileged position to be able to study, have access to materials, have the leisure to read and carefully analyze. A lot of people don't have the time, neither do they have the resources and the capacity to work through that. On the subjective side, there are a multitude of reasons why someone would choose to believe in a conspiracy theory that is highly improbable or disbelieve in news reports that are supported by multiple credible sources. Just a few examples. First, none of us can grasp the enormous complexity of the world we live in, so we tend to simplify. We all have our prejudices and tend to filter news based on what we already believe to be true. And as shocking as it may seem that a Christian would ignore the plight of innocent Ukrainians and emphasize the reasonableness of Putin's griefs against the USA and NATO, A careful look at the values and worldview of these same Christians would reveal that indeed there is certain consistency there. We may all claim to be Christian, but the differences between the meta-narratives we believe in and the values we emphasize are consistently leading us to different evaluations of the same facts, or to filtering one set of facts in favor of another. For example, many of these so-called neutral Christians feel threatened by the so-called Western liberal agenda, calling it gays and whatever else, and view Putin as a defender of traditional Christian values. So there is a sense in which they're consciously siding with the party that confirms with their biases. Second, it becomes ever more obvious that as human beings, we're not as rational as we tend to assume we are. Most of our choices stem not from rational analysis, but are the result of emotional triggers. Some, for example, I believe, have chosen the position of neutrality in this conflict because they have been deceived before and they're afraid to commit again. I think there are many also who trusted in America as if it was the savior, and because they ended up disappointed, now they're turning against it. Unfortunately, they do not realize that not choosing a side is also a choice, so there really is no safe position. They're choosing neutrality in order to relieve the tension, but then are faced with the reaction of friends who view them as insensitive, which puts them in a defensive mode. And as a result, many become quite aggressive in defending their position and criticizing the positions of others. Ironically, though wishing to stay neutral, they end up radically attacking supporters of Ukraine and supporting Putin. Lastly, I would like to quote a young friend of mine with a degree in psychology who thinks that most of us are simply scared by chaos and have no idea how frail human beings and our creations really are. We're always looking for some all-encompassing but simple enough explanation that would allow us to continue hoping that the evil around us is not accidental. Because if evil is fortuitous, then how do we fight it and how do we inflict revenge? For many times, that is exactly what we're most looking for, retribution. Therefore, we are prone to come up with enemies, conspiracies, mythical players at the chessboard of the gods. While in reality, our entire civilization and its structures is exceptionally fragile, like a tower of cards held up by our relative incompetence and limited perspective. The true miracle and the only real conspiracy, a divine conspiracy, I believe, is that somehow we continue to evolve and work for good in this world. So what is my response in conclusion to friends and acquaintances engaging in all of the above reactions and activities? I have been constantly reminding myself that virtual social networks tend to present a very distorted image of a person. They tend to highlight weaknesses like gaps in one's general knowledge or lack of critical thinking skills, but those do not necessarily account for the entire person. Because I've seen numerous examples of acquaintances using poor arguments in defense of bad positions, but then acting sacrificially in contradiction to their views or words. And this is the very same type of contradiction observed when I personally fail to live up to the noble values which I otherwise promote in my speaking. Therefore, when engaging with someone online, I'm trying to focus on their humanity and our mutual brokenness. I'm trying to ask questions. It's a new thing for me, and I'm barely learning to walk in this way. Ultimately, I'm often reminded of the biblical story of the prophet Elijah. Facing continuous opposition from the king of Israel and his pagan wife, and observing how this corrupt pair is corrupting the nation and keeping it under their evil control, the prophet reaches a state of desperation and wishes to die. God's response to him is one of perspective. The news that he is not the only one left, and that there are several thousands of faithful people like himself that God will use to make a change. I too am convinced that it is in the nature of evil that it self-destructs and is therefore transient, while good people cannot be silenced or stopped by any means. This is my hope and motivation.
Andrew, thank you very much. I consider it that your presentation was very, very insightful. I mean, there is so much we can now talk about. I'm looking at the time. I think we can afford 20 minutes of our conversation at this point. I'm looking at a comment that is placed here by Tihomir Rodorčić from Slovenia. And this comment might not be maybe exactly so at this time in the US so much anymore, but definitely I think it is very much true for the region you're coming from, I'm coming from, basically Southeast Europe and East Europe. He says it is very interesting to see that same persons are saying there is no virus, the vaccines are of no help. Russians have the right to tear apart another country because of geostrategic balance, or democracy is an obsolete form of rule. That's a very interesting statement shared by Tihomir. I find this that it is pretty much accurate for Europe, definitely Balkan, Southeast Europe, and East Europe. And I would like to encourage you, friends, while we still have some time, you can share your comments or maybe put a question and we'll see how much we can go. But I would now like to bring a question to all of you panelists, because something that bothers me is, I don't know whether it bothers me, but definitely something I'm thinking all the time, especially over the last 2 weeks, is how do we, as followers of Jesus, Christians, internationally speaking, ought to relate to crises such as this one, where we have a blatant aggression of one country on another one that has done her nothing wrong, that has not provoked that country into war. How do we relate in a sound, healthy, Jesus-like manner? I have myself been receiving comments yesterday I got from a person I know. You know, there was a time when I used to be a pastor, and he writes, "You are a pastor. You should be neutral. You should be preaching the gospel and not to be meddling with politics. You never know what is really true in all of this." And what do you say to this person? How do we develop a sound response that is not kind of cosmetic, that is not glossing over, giving a lip service, gaslighting in any form, but that is really honest and straightforward, whatever the outcome? I just wonder, among our panelists, anyone who would like to join in the conversation, and let's elaborate, because to me, when we do these webinars, I'm always driven by one question, and this is, what about us followers of Jesus? What would Jesus do? What is the true gospel-like Christian approach to the challenges we are facing? So
I can start because the rest are so shy.
all right.
But I do hope that they will also attempt to answer this question, because I'm curious to hear what they say. But I just wanted to say, of course, it's a very complex question, and I'm not going to try to answer it in full. But I think the question that you're asking, Tihomir, is a little bit easier for us who can do something very practically right now. Because the Bible is very clear when it comes to how to love your neighbor, in the sense of receiving the foreigner, or taking care of the poor or the orphan. When we received 135 Jewish orphans here in Cluj in this previous week, it was no question of what's the Christian response. You take care of them with everything that you have, that is just what you do. In that way, it's very simple. There's no theological dilemma here. On the other hand, if you look at treating refugees in general, not just Ukrainian refugees, but refugees in general, we know that there's a lot of conflict and tensions also among Christians, and different opinions about how refugees should be treated. And in my opinion, there is very strong biblical foundation to support the argument that we should not really bother ourselves too much with where they're coming from, or what skin color they have, or what religion they have, or what sexual preferences they have, or anything else. What we should be concerned with is how we receive them, and receive them in love. That is my opinion about the current situation, how we should receive refugees. When it comes to differences of opinion and how to handle differences of opinion, Tihomir, this is something we keep going back to, and it's very, very difficult. I think the Christian response to a friend who comes to you with these opinions would be, first of all, to be honest, to listen respectfully and respectfully disagree in no unclear terms if you disagree, and to meet the person as a person, not as an enemy, and continue loving them even if they are holding very anti-Christian, let's say, opinions.
Thank you, Camilla. I'm glad that I personally have received, and honestly, I didn't even have time to respond to all of them, although I promised, probably 10 emails and questions, and I'm being encouraged. People from my church, people that I know here from America who are asking questions, what can I do? What can I do? And to me, this is a really encouraging sign when it's a level of empathy, you know. It's a level of empathy. So yes, you are right. When people engage, it's easier to be practical about this than if you are not. I'm reading here the comments that are coming now, but there was one here that I want to share with you, and maybe you can have an opinion about this. And this is sent by Alan and Dawn Staff. Democracy is great while you are in the majority, but as Christians find themselves in minority, they begin to think that it is not such a great idea, and more autocratic models appeal if they seem to support your personal viewpoint. I think that's a very true statement and powerful statement. That's probably partially also the answer why some Christians are so much leaning towards dictatorship. Because in some instances, they feel safer under the dictatorship. If a dictator promises that he or she is going to defend their values, doesn't matter that this dictator is actually crushing all of them and crushing the life around. But you know, if few cherished values are being protected, then people tend to lean. Any thought on that? Any thought on that?
Yes. I would actually note that's true for Christians who become the minority while they're living in democracy. It's definitely not true for Christians who are a minority under an autocratic regime. I mean, all Christians around, I'm pretty sure of that, but all of us in Eastern Europe who lived under communism, we dreamt of democracy, even though we were minorities as Christians, because we didn't have freedom and we knew what it was. It was something to strive for. But I can see your point that for the Western world, where Christians have enjoyed some level of freedom, maybe not absolute, but quite generous for ages, and now we're losing their privileged position. Autocratic regimes become very attractive. Probably the best antidote to that is to just bring them in community with their brothers and sisters from other parts of the world, so that they can get another picture. A lot of what I get from the US is just ignorant. I'm saying that not in a bad sense, not to slight the people, but it's just coming from a very limited perspective.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you for your comments that are coming. Comments, I honestly have to say, I'm not able to read them all that quickly, But while I'm doing this, is there any other observation from you panelists that kind of, as we are trying to converse now, along the kind of conversation we have developed after the official part, or something you would like to reflect on someone else sharing during our first part of this webinar? Any additional thought?
I love the fact that most of the speakers tonight agree that we have to come towards each other. There is enough war around us. We don't need to bring it in our relationships. We don't need to bring it within ourselves. And obviously one thing that is becoming more and more in my face as the days develop is the humanity of the humans. I don't even know how to say it. How fragile we are, how reactive we are, how small we are, how clueless we are. It doesn't matter how many diplomas our friends from Ukraine have. They are leaving the country with one bag, and they're running, and they're afraid, and they're cold, and they get depression. As this as our program was developing, I actually received a message about one Ukrainian lady, 26 years old, that wants to go back to Odessa, and basically she wants to be assisted into dying because she's just too fragile for this madness around her. Romania and Romanian borders are at the moment like a China store. A big elephant is pushing everything towards us at the moment. With respect, Andrew, and Camilla and Jill, I'm just a poet. I speak about how I feel. I don't speak politics. I don't speak, and I also speak what I see. It's real. We were in touch with some friend, a British, who was teaching English and mathematics to children in Kiev for many years. And then his wife saw, because she flew in 2014, she fled from Crimea. So she saw the signs of the war, of the coming war, and they fled. And then the war came. They tried to take everybody they could with them, but they didn't want to listen. So at the very extreme western border of Ukraine, they rented 2 apartments and they tried to help. And they took the decision, the moment their friends or family started dying, they'll flee. And they heard how Romanians are welcoming them. So they said, we're going to flee to Romania. So after 1 week of communicating and trying to extract people from different places in Kiev and Ukraine, we received one morning. We received one message and said we're coming, which meant they started losing friends. And this guy was so strong while we're communicating and all that, and quite a smart guy. And we, Camila and I, were at the border. It took 3 hours for them to cross for reasons I cannot explain. But then that evening, they were the only one, their family, they were the only one crossing by foot. They didn't have a car. They're just dragging their luggage, and they came towards us. And they got to the car. They received a superb welcome by all the Romanians at the border there. And then Everybody was in the car, and he gets in the car, the last one, and he just breaks down. He starts crying. He's not the smart friend of ours. He's not the one keeping his eyes and helping people to escape. He's just human. You know, we could carry on the discussion. You can be a gay, you can be a prostitute, you can be a priest, you can be a president. Why do we have to wait for the war or for a war to come in order to realize we're basically all the same somewhere underneath? And as a followers of Jesus, Tikhomir, you ask, what would Jesus do? I don't think he would be so aggressive as some of us Christians, if you want, tend to be.
Thank you, Liviu. I'm mindful about the time, but I do have a question for Anya, because you are coming from the real situation. It doesn't matter that you are not in Ukraine now, but you are from that country. You moved to Ireland just before everything started, and you are in yourself, as you're saying, a different person now because of all of this that is happening in Ukraine. What would your advice be to all of us, to our Western friends, brothers and sisters? How can we be of a genuine help at this time to you and people like you and your country?
It's very difficult to give a kind of one advice, or I think that in the situation like this, it's important to be grateful for what you have, for peaceful skies that you have, for your families to be safe without war, and just to be grateful for family you have. It doesn't matter if you have conflicts with your family or disagreements, but you have them. And reach out to your friends, be humble, don't be afraid to reach out and say whatever you have to say, whatever you want to say. I received a lot of messages from people. Some of them I met only once in my life, but they found time to ask how am I and if I need anything. And some people with whom I've been very close did not write anything to me. So it's really, in the situation like this, it's really to be human, to try to be empathic to yourself, to your closed ones. Many people ask me whom to donate, how to help. I personally donate my money to my army and my law enforcement, because these people are the only people that right now protecting everything I have in my country. I know how big international organizations work, and I know that many people are donating to these big names organizations, but then they will be operating only through small NGOs. So I would donate to my friends who are asking for money to buy whatever they need, protection gear or food. And I would also support small trusted NGOs who actually have people in the country in place and who that they actually do the work. I've just finished a meeting with the board of NGO that I'm supporting and I'm a member of. This NGO has a unique niche because it works with children and helps them heal through music. And we will now be working with children in Ukraine online, those children who are in bomb shelters, through online programs. And then we will be going physically to the border countries and working with children who are refugees to help them heal the trauma of war through music. Pray for Ukraine. I know that it's very powerful, and everyone is praying now. Everyone, believers or non-believers, everyone prays. And I know that the universe will hear these prayers and Ukraine will win. Because if Ukraine does not win, there might not be a world as we know it anymore. So this, I think, would be my words. Thank you.
So again, thank you, Anya, for your honest response to my question. And I think this is probably a good time for us to bring everything now to closure. I can only say that probably most of the people who are going to listen to this webinar are probably more inclined to help this huge number of people who are displaced and refugees. And that is also, I think, a very legitimate way of helping this situation. And here in this circle, you have also people who know probably to lead you to some of the places that are engaged in actually helping the refugees. I can give you some ideas if you contact me too. We are coming to the end. Maybe we have not answered all of the questions. We have just opened the box with the questions. But I would just like to conclude and say that in my view, and this is not political, it's simply human. It's simply human. I think it's appropriate thing that those who are following Jesus condemn this aggression, because the situation is clear-cut. It's not like as if Ukraine has been messing around and messing with the neighboring countries around and provoking one and provoking the other one, and for 10 years creating confusion in the region, and then someone needs to teach it a lesson. It's not that. It is a clear-cut, naked, evil aggression of one big country upon another country. That is a sovereign country, legitimate country, in existence as such for at least 30 years. And no one on earth has a right to reconstruct this, cancel it in any way, and try to rewrite the history and say, we are going to go to some golden age of this or that when you were dominated by us. At least for me, this is the guideline, what attitude I take. And I know that this was a very symbolic statement. It will not make any change on the ground. But the first Saturday when this happened, I joined the protesters here, the Ukrainian community and the others. We were about 500 of us in Houston, in a symbolic statement of basically saying, I am against this aggression. And we were standing as a civilized group of people in front of the Russian consulate. That was a symbolic statement. It won't change much. But at least I felt a little bit better that in this way, I also said, I'm not in agreement with this. I can't be neutral about this. I can't pretend I'm not seeing it. I'm not going to spiritualize it away. I'm not going to quote biblical verses over it to deflect the meaning of what is happening. That's just my reflection at the end of this. Thank you very much, my friends, panelists, each one of you. Thank you for really contributing, I would say, with very powerful reflections on the current situation and how democracy is being chipped away step by step in our world. And thank you, all of you, my friends who have joined us today on this Zoom call, that you've been faithfully with us. We will let you know soon again when we are going to have another event of a similar nature. Thank you again, and God bless you.